Good morning and welcome to the Children's Museum of Atlanta's third Town Square. This is a virtual series designed for families, educators, and the community to learn about and discuss important issues and challenges that are weighing on so many of us right now. Children's museums around the country serve as town squares for families with young children. We're a gathering place where all are invited to explore, engage, and learn in the way that children learn best, through play. We're not about any one topic, we're about a lot of topics. And most importantly, we're about the development of the whole child and introducing them to new experiences and people, and to create an environment where self-exploration, discovery, and learning are really what is happening. We've always worked to be a welcoming place, and our exhibits and programs at the museum and also out in the community highlight and celebrate a large variety of topics, from science and math, geography, engineering, visual arts, performing arts, literacy, nutrition, health, and importantly, the many cultures that make Atlanta the diverse and very rich community that it is. Over the past few months, we've been hearing from families and educators who are seeking meaningful conversations, information, resources, and ideas to help them navigate this challenging time. We consider ourselves to be so fortunate to be able to bring these conversations to you. On a housekeeping note, as we have this conversation, please send us any questions as comments on your Facebook Live screen, and we will plan to answer as many as we possibly can. This morning, I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Brian Williams. Brian is the director of the Alonzo A. Krim Center for the Urban Education Excellence and a clinical professor at the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education in the College of Education and Human Development at Georgia State University. Before he joined the faculty at GSU, Brian coordinated the Math Science Equity Program at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. That program examined the link between parental involvement and the tracking of African American students in science. His work has been published in Democracy in Education, School and Community Journal, Negro Education Review, and the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. Dr. Williams has over 15 years of experience working with teachers and students in science education. He's taught science methods and content courses to K through 12 teachers in the United States and countries around the world. Because of his extensive work in the fields of science and education, Dr. Williams has also served as a consultant to organizations such as the National Science Foundation, the Educational Development Center, and Quality Education for Minorities. Brian earns his PhD from Emory University here in Atlanta and his Master's of Science from Georgia Tech. He's a former Ford Foundation Fellow and a Spencer Fellow. Most importantly, perhaps, to all of us at the Children's Museum, Brian has been an unbelievable advisor on our Exhibits and Education Committee for over a decade. And on many Sundays, you can find him at the museum in his absolutely beloved role as Dr. Science, holding amazing and messy science workshops for children and their families here. I want to welcome Brian.
Thank you, Jane. It's wonderful to be here.
Brian, can we start off hearing from you a little bit about your work and why you thought it was important to be a part of this discussion today?
Yeah, so Jane, first I'll say, I think that these town halls that the museum has decided to do are extremely relevant and valuable at this point in time in our country's history. So kudos to the museum for stepping up in this way. I've been doing this work, and my bio said 15 years, but I turned 48 years old this year. And so I've been doing this work for 48 years in some ways, because I was raised in a family that really valued equity. The ideas around racial equity and racial justice have been a part of my upbringing. And then as a result, it became a part of my life and then a part of my work. And so when the museum proposed this idea of talking with our Atlanta community, specifically about what's going on with regards to equity in public education, I thought this was a really, really a wonderful opportunity. I didn't want to pass it up. So I'm excited about this opportunity to kind of engage people in a deeper conversation about not necessarily what happens in our classrooms with regards to teachers and students, that's important, and or between parents and the school. I think that's very important. I know some of our other speakers have touched on those topics, but the bigger issue of equity in public education, I think, is a conversation that really needs to be had in our country right now. Yeah.
That's great. So since today's discussion is going to be centered, I believe, on the challenges we're facing in ensuring true equity in public schools throughout every district, every neighborhood, the opportunities and quality of the experience can vary widely, I know, from one public school to the next. Can you talk about your understanding and experience on this particular topic, that the differences that exist?
Definitely. And I think that in order to really understand what's going on in terms of public education and equity, I think it's important to almost situate it in a historical context, right? Because I think that we can look at what's going on today and say, oh, you know, what's going on in this community that's creating such challenges for the schools in this community that we don't see the same types of challenges over in this community, without looking at things like systemic racism and classism that have been a part of our country for a very, very long time. So if we think back, and we go way back into your history books, right, and you look at where we were at the founding of this country and the people that were in the room deciding who would have power, who would have privilege, who would this country ultimately serve? Well, if you look at the men in that room, it was generally white men with wealth that were creating what our country would be. And even in our Constitution, the people that are generally looked at as the people that would hold power, that would have access, tended to be people who were English speaking, white, male, right, in positions of power. Our country, coming forward from that place, has continued to struggle with who has access, who has opportunity, and why. And our schools aren't sitting in a vacuum. They don't sit in a bubble. So they also are infected by those same challenges, those same struggles. So when we talk about equity in public education, I think it's important to recognize that our public schools sit within a greater system that for a very long time, since the founding of this country, have privileged certain people based on race, based on class, and based on gender. And so the problems that we see most often in our schools are these things influencing the education of our children. So for example, we see things like our curriculum being skewed in such a way that it speaks to the lived experiences, it speaks to the culture, it speaks to the values, it speaks to the language of a specific sect of our community, and not all children. And so when you have a child that goes into a classroom every single day, daily, and is introduced to a curriculum that tells them nothing about who they are, does not value their language, does not value their curriculum, that child is going to engage in a very different way from a child that does feel loved, that does feel cared about, you know, or does seem seen by the curriculum. So that's one example of just how this part of who we are as a country has infected our schools.
That's really interesting. So when a community or a neighborhood is viewed as at risk, I mean, you hear that a lot. What impact does that have on the school in that neighborhood, the curriculum, the teachers, and the families who are sending their children to those schools? Yeah,
and we use that term a lot, right? At risk. And in some ways, in some cases, that term can be problematic because it can color a child as being predestined for failure, right? We can use that term at risk to stereotype children as they're just going to fail in school, right? And I think that if we really think about it, the idea of a child being at risk means they're at risk of not graduating, they're at risk of possibly dropping out of school. But the other thing is that we need to look at is, well, why are they at risk? And so I think that if we're saying, well, they're at risk because they're suffering from housing insecurity, they're suffering from food insecurity, they're suffering from teachers in their classrooms that have not been prepared to or I shouldn't say teachers, people in their classroom who have not been prepared to adequately provide those children with an effective education. They're suffering from mental health issues. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in certain communities that put children at risk for challenges in schools. And back to my earlier point, a lot of those things are rooted once again in the ways that this country has dealt with the question of class, the question of race, and how it affects people's lives. And so it's no surprise that we see these children who are at risk in communities that are dealing with the challenge of poverty, or in communities that have significant numbers of people of color, or children who English is not their first language, or immigrants or refugees, right? And so I think, we need to begin to think about not just what happens in the school, but the larger system that surrounds the school, and to begin thinking about, okay, well, if we want to see better academic outcomes, or we want our schools to be more effective, then we've got to deal with things like housing insecurity and food insecurity and access to a fair wage, right? These are the things that will help our schools actually serve our children better.
So when families are coming to schools, what are sometimes subtle messages that are communicated to parents? They're not front and center messages or being stated necessarily, that either encourage or discourage participation in their child's educational experience. Because we know that the parents of the child's first teacher, they're really that's where the child is really getting a lot of messages. Parents get messages from schools, and I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think the first thing we got to realize is that education is a cultural experience, right? And that the way that I connect with my teacher, the way that I connect with the content, the way that I connect with my classmates is very cultural. And so if schools are presenting one culture as being the normative culture, this is who we love, this is who we see, when, then there are going to be people that come into that school that immediately feel like, I am not wanted here, I am not valued here. So a nice example. And I could probably give you a list of these types of signs that I've seen on schools. But I had the opportunity to go to a school recently, and on the front door of the school was a sign that said, if you're wearing pajama pants, basically, they probably said it better than I'm going to say it, but basically it said, if you're wearing pajama pants, just turn around and go home, right? You are not welcome here. And so I understood in some ways what they were trying to say, I think, which was, we have expectations for the way that people dress when they come into this school. We think that it has an influence on the way that your children see you, that we see you, and we have expectations. However, a parent that wears pajama pants, first of all, we don't know why this parent is wearing pajama pants, right? But the second thing is that when that parent comes up to the school, which is a win for us, we love for our parents to come to the school. We want to see our parents. We want our parents to feel welcome here. But when that parent comes to that school wearing those pajama pants and sees that sign and turns around and goes the other direction, we've lost an opportunity to really engage with that parent. Chances are that parent won't feel very welcome at that school again. Chances are that parent won't return to the school again. And so there's subtle things that we do to parents every single day that just tell them who's valued and who's not, and who's welcomed and who's not. I think the other piece is that, going back to this idea of parental involvement being very cultural, the expectations that we have for the ways that parents engage in schools is rooted in, once again, the idea of centering whiteness and this idea of white people's ideas about what is parental involvement, right? So in my community growing up, and I grew up in the African-American community in New Orleans. And so in my community growing up, the way that teachers and parents worked together, there was an expectation that teachers were professionals, they were well trained. They knew what they were doing when they were in the classroom. We have lots of those teachers in our classrooms today. And the position of parents was that We trusted what was going on in the school. We trusted what the teachers were doing, and that we were going to work together with teachers to raise children. So a teacher would call a parent when the child was maybe misbehaving in class or doing something that was considered to be the parent's responsibility in terms of raising that child. And the teacher was responsible for the curriculum and the instruction, and together we would raise this child. But the idea of a parent coming up to the school and telling a teacher that wasn't that type of relationship. It was very, very different. And it's rooted in many ways in the way that the African-American community has thought about teachers and thought about education. And so they have an expectation that different cultures are going to interact in the school in the exact same way is in some ways unjust, oppressive, and inequitable.
So interesting. So when you think about this as existing like this, what can our community do? How do we begin to address these issues, in your opinion? Thinking of parents, teachers, political leaders in our community, how do we address this so that families feel welcome, so that children are seeing their own cultures identified, so that there's this sense of inclusion and partnership, as you described, in the schools, all schools?
I think that our history in this country has been one of segregation, right? We live in communities that are largely homogeneous, right? In terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of language, right? So we live in these homogeneous communities, but then we have the expectation that in our schools, our children will be educated in such a way that will help them understand things like equity and justice and diversity. And the two things it doesn't really work that way. In fact, if we look at Jim Crow in the South, the Jim Crow laws in the South, a lot of those laws were created for one reason alone, and that was to keep people apart from each other, to keep people segregated. Because as soon as people begin to sit down and talk with each other and learn about each other, then they begin to realize that these lies I've been told about the way Black people are, or the way that poor people are, or the way that immigrants are, all of those narratives just kind of disappear. And they're replaced with true, authentic relationships. So I think one of the things that we can begin to do is to begin to learn about other people, to break out of these segregated communities that we are, and to take some risk to learn deeply about other people from those people, not from somebody else who's telling us about them, but from those people. I think that's one thing we can do. I think another thing we can do is to have a clear vision for what we want in public education. So if I ask somebody today, tell me, what is the purpose of public education? Right? So we have these little children, these babies that are born, and we celebrate the birth of these children, and we put pictures up on Facebook, and for the first 5 years of their lives, we keep them close to us and we love on them and we cherish them. And then around 5 years old, we take them to this building and we give them to somebody and we say, they're yours. For about 8 hours a day, they're yours. And so the question would be, all right, so then what is the purpose of this system that we're turning our children over to? Some would argue that the purpose of this system is to prepare our children for college and career. In fact, for a lot of our schools here in Georgia, the way that we measure success is the College and Career Readiness Performance Index. Like how many of our kids are getting to college and how many of them are getting jobs? And I think that's important. I think we want our children to be able to get jobs. And many of us want them to go to college. But don't we also want them to be active and engaged citizens? Don't we want them to be active and engaged members of their communities? We want them to be financially literate. We want them to be good people, right? To understand morality and ethics. All of these are things that we want for our children, but yet and still our schools are framed in such a way that says that really what we're about doing is preparing our kids for college and career. It's why we see arts being taken out of our schools. It's why we see music being taken out of our schools. To the museum's point, this is why we see play taken out of our schools, right? For a very long time, schools here in Georgia had said no more recess for elementary school kids, right? Because once again, it's not about centering our children and their growth as a human being. It's about preparing them for the workplace. So we need to have a better vision about what we truly, truly, truly want for our kids and what is the purpose of education. And then I think the last thing we need to do is to be very vigilant, is to be very clear about what's happening in education. What are the policies? What are the laws that are framing what's happening in our schools? How is it that a program like Teach for America managed to kind of slip right under the radar and into our schools? So here's a program that's designed to take individuals who are very well intentioned, but not very well trained, and put them into schools where we need the best teachers in the world, the schools where the kids are facing, to our earlier conversation talking about at-risk kids, children who have the greatest number of risk factors in their communities. They need fantastic teachers. But instead, we're giving them people who've had a summer boot camp and putting those children these teachers in these schools with kids who have really, really great needs. How in the world did that ever slip by us as a great idea? So I think we need to be very well educated and pay very close attention to what's happening in the place that is taking care of the people we probably love the most, our children.
This is such a big topic and so important, particularly right now. I know, Brian, that you are going to share some resources with us, and I'm going to ask our wonderful Stacy to share. Oh, great, here they are. Would love for you to talk through some of the things that you brought that will be staying with this recording and on our Facebook page.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I brought a couple of things. One, to this idea of people becoming better informed. There are some publications, some websites that I think would help you to kind of get a better idea of what's going on with regards to equity in public education. So once again, talking big picture here. So the first one is Rethinking Schools. This is a publication and a website, so you can actually order this and it'll come straight to your home. It's a wonderful magazine. And every month it will deal with issues that are influencing the way that we think about equity in public education, from everything right now from voting rights to what's going on in terms of returning to school with coronavirus. So for people that want a really easy way to get up to speed, to become better informed, Rethinking Schools is a great resource for you. Let me go to the next one. So a step up from Rethinking Schools, and a deeper dive into what's going on with regards to public education, policy, research, and things like that, is the Learning Policy Institute. So this was founded by Dr. Linda Darling Hammond, prolific researcher and scholar in the field of public education. And so what she's been able to do is to kind of create a community of people that are sharing their ideas on how do we create schools that are more equitable, and what are the major challenges that are facing our children and teachers and our schools and parents with regards to public education. And so she does a really nice job of just kind of presenting the information in a very clear and concise way. So if you're looking, once again, for easy access to some great information, I think this is a great place to go. So we're moving now from information to action. Like, what can we do? And there are some people that are becoming active. I shouldn't say becoming, because many people have been doing this work for generations. So I don't want to say becoming. This work has been going on for a very long time. So QECR, Quality Education as a Constitutional Right, is the organization that comes out of the work of Dr. Bob Moses. And so many people don't know this, but in our Constitution, there is no guarantee for a fair and equitable education, for access to a fair and equitable education. It's not in our federal Constitution. So when it comes to education, it's at the level of the state. And so what QECR is trying to do is, leveraging the 14th Amendment, is try to figure out a way to guarantee an excellent education, an equitable education for every child in the United States. They're asking for this to be in our Constitution. Aside from QECR, in terms of being active, we have an election coming up. One of the things I think that we can pay attention to is what's going on the ground with our school boards. Learn who your school board members are, because those are the people that are actually framing education in your local school district. And so there's another opportunity by just getting engaged in this upcoming election and with our school board elections. And then the final two are programs that are done out of the Crim Center. Jane, you mentioned the Crim Center, and I'm director of the Crim Center. And so we do two big events each year that give people an opportunity to come and learn about what's going on with regards to public education, but more specifically, how do we cultivate equity and excellence in public education? So the first is the Sources of Urban Educational Conference, or Urban Educational Excellence Conference. It happens every fall. This year, it will be a virtual conference. The dates listed here are October 17th, but we're actually pushing it a little bit in response to the COVID crisis. And so it'll happen in early November, and it will be virtual, but it'll be an opportunity for people to engage with folks that are doing a really amazing work around the country with regards to equity in public education. And then in the spring, we host the Benjamin E. Mays Lecture. And this lecture series brings a well-regarded scholar or activist, community leader who's doing work with regards to excellence in public education to the city of Atlanta. Last year, it was Dr. Linda Darling Hammond. And it gives, once again, it gives the community an opportunity to engage with people and learn about what's going on in public education and how we create more equitable schools.
Super. And what a great opportunity and timely for your conference. And since it is virtual this year, nobody has to drive. You can just attend, which I'm looking forward to that. I did get a question. We have just a few minutes left, and I got a question from one of our listeners. Actually, a few questions, but we'll get through as many as we can. Someone asked about the impact of the COVID-19 on the structure of learning. And, that's going to have an impact on equity in education. But they specifically wanted to know what we as parents can do to support each other during this virtual learning experience. If you have any thoughts on that, because that's going to be really hard for families.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. And, the COVID has already affected many of our children's learning, right? Because we have children that weren't engaging in virtual learning in March and April. And so I think one of the things that teachers, that parents can do, and I ask this of my teachers every year in my kids' school, is I go to my teachers and I say, what can I do to support what you're doing in the classroom? Once again, this team effort between teachers and parents to raise our children, I think, is going to be key. And I think also teachers can advise parents who are often, they don't know about this thing we call teaching and learning. I mean, it's a process. And so teachers can advise parents, here are some of the things, here are some of the resources that you can access, things that you can do at your home that will support your child's learning. So I think that's key. Get in touch with your child's teacher and begin to build that partnership.
That's like such a perfect idea. And I know that teachers are all struggling right now because they're having to really adapt in a way that was just unimaginable even 6 months ago. Yeah. And so I think that relationship and connection to parents would be really important for them as well. Yeah. So I have another question that's come in, one more question, which is, and this is a big question. What does your ideal educational system look like? Yeah, that's a big question. So can you answer that in about 2 seconds?
Here's the thing, right? I put it like this: we center children. We center children. So this idea of a child is a construct for us. We, for some reason, don't think that our children are whole and complete human beings. But they are, and they have hopes and dreams and goals and fears. Let's create a school system that centers our children, that focuses not on what we want our children to be, but who they are. That, to me, would be the school system of my dreams.
From your mouth, that is the best. I think that would be so wonderful. And honestly, at the Children's Museum, that is what we're all about. We look and what do children need? How do they learn? What do they need to grow and thrive? That should be throughout any organization that is attempting to provide enriching experience for children.
We start there and we build. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Brian, Dr. Science, thank you so much for spending the morning with us.
See how neat this was, Jane? It was so neat. No mess at all.
No mess at all. Yeah. Normally we go into our workshops after you've been there and, it's sticky and gooey, and that's a good thing because it means there's been a lot of activity going on, a lot of learning, a lot of hands-on engagement. So thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you for having me.